to welcome everyone back who was here yesterday, and to welcome everyone who wasn't here yesterday to our Decolonising Modern Languages conference. It's a symposium for sharing practices and ideas. Just a few things to be aware of before we begin today. We have had some very small changes to the programme, and what I will do in a minute is post a link to the latest programme, which is on the IMLR's website, so you can just look at that. That's just some speakers who couldn't make it yesterday we've put them in the programme later. So I'll post a link in the chat to that in a second. If you'd like to forward that link to anyone, then could you please do so, but make sure that it's the IMLR link, not the Zoom link, because we like to keep an eye on numbers of people signed up to the session. So if you'd like anyone else to join, please do forward them the IMLR link, which I'll post in the chat in a second, and they can sign up through there. That's so we can just keep an eye on the stats. And then one final reminder to speakers: if you are happy to have your session recorded, then could you please return the consent form that I sent out last week. So that's just a reminder for speakers. And I think that's all the housekeeping. So I'll move straight on to our first panel today, which is an institutional panel. So this is from colleagues in modern languages, or in I should say languages, cultures and societies at the University of Leeds, as they're now known. And it's a great pleasure to welcome colleagues from Leeds. I did my PhD at Leeds, so it's really lovely to see some familiar faces and to hear about work that's going on at Leeds. So I'll briefly present the speakers, and then we'll move on to Nina's paper, followed by Fozia and Stephan. So Nina Wardleworth is Associate Professor in French at the University of Leeds, and she currently leads the University Strategy for Inclusive Curriculum Design. And today, Nina will speak about reconceptualizing European identity. So I'll pass right over to you, Nina, if that's okay. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe, and I'm sorry about the bit of the confusion at the beginning. I'm in the middle of a house move at the moment, and so I find myself without internet where we're living, and so I've had to hijack my husband's phone, which is why I'm also completely low tech and no PowerPoint, and I do apologise, and thank you to you in the audience for your patience. So one of the criticisms that I hear again and again from students as part of my university post for inclusive curriculum design, which is what we've come to decide at Leeds is the easiest way of talking about decolonising the curriculum, because it allows us to go across arts and humanities and STEM and not raise people's hackles, unfortunately, as soon as it's mentioned. So one of the most recent current criticisms that I hear from students when I'm in that post is they're frustrated by courses that simply have a race week or a gender week. They feel that there's often just simply a nod to the campaign at Leeds and across universities globally, led by student unions, on why is my curriculum white. They think that there's often just a nod to diversifying in reading this without a real examination of the colonial hierarchies and legacies that underpin all university disciplines. And I think it's particularly true for modern languages, where our graduates were for decades destined to staff our colonial ministries, our embassies abroad, after the fall of the empire, and major companies too that kind of became sort of pseudo neo-colonizers. And so as a discipline, we're far from immune from such loaded legacies. What we've tried to do in the School of Languages, Cultures and Societies, we're going to talk. I'll talk about that today along with colleagues Fozia, Bora from Arabic, Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, and Stephan Petzold from German, is to think about the very nature of our modules, to rethink these, think about our optional modules, but also importantly our core modules, and think about how we can decolonize all of our offering. And we're at the very beginning of this, and we've still got a long way to go. It's not always been easy, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all and from your practices as well. So thank you to Joe and Emmanuel for organising this conference, shifting it online, and especially the emphasis that they placed on debate and discussion in this session. So as I said, practical issues of house moving during COVID means that I've not been able to follow the earlier panels, so I'm very much looking forward to watching the recordings, and that is why I'm very low tech today. So what I wanted to talk about today is a level 2 undergraduate module, which I devised with a lot of input from colleagues, and which I team teach with a number of colleagues across the school, including Stephan Petzold, who's going to be speaking today. So it's a module that's about to enter its 3rd year, and it's a module that we've entitled Black Europe. And I said in my paper was going to reconceptualize European identities, and that's really the aim of this module, to radically rethink the concept of European identity, European identities, a concept that's so inherent to so many of our modern languages degrees across the UK and in the West, if I can use that sort of terminology, though I've started to realise that in the States often they're called sort of Western civilization courses, and that's very problematic as a term. This idea of European identities and its link to modern languages is also inherent in pre-university school and college courses, and we have to recognise this and recognise the position from which our students are coming to us for their university studies. So this module, Black Europe, is an option available to all our single honours and to our joint honours students in the school. But it's also very popular across a number of other subjects across our arts, humanities and cultures faculty, and especially our university liberal arts degrees, where more and more students are taking on a language component as part of this degree. So we're drawing students from a range of different backgrounds. So the module Black Europe examines the centrality of race to the construction of national and pan-European identities in so many European nations in the 19th and 20th century. A concept that was, and actually as the Brexit debates have shown us, continues to be easier to define when we think about ourselves in opposition to another. Okay, so what is our identity and how have we defined that by thinking about what we're not? In this case, it was, and it often still is, the racial other. At the beginning, the colonial indigenous subject in the colonies, the exhibited other in the colonial metropole, one of the issues that Stephan works with in the German section of this module. It can also be the migrant other recruited to rebuild Europe in the post-war era. And one thing we talk about a lot in Black Europe is now the refugee other fleeing war and poverty. The module is also designed to place the cultural output from Black European populations at its very heart, far from being the sort of add-on to a course, as students have often highlighted that it is. So the students on the course work with a range of cultural genres, from photography to poetry, cinema and autobiography. And because we take students from a range of languages, they are working with those texts in English translation, but we do encourage them to read it in the original if possible, and to work with texts in the languages they study for their assessment and their preparation work. As possibly the largest languages school in any UK university, we're lucky to be able to draw upon research and teaching interests from a number of European languages, as well as other disciplines such as classics and Islamic studies. And this breadth has been much praised by the students on the course so far, as an opportunity to understand the commonality of themes, issues and outputs across national borders, languages and time periods, covering millennia, as we do in this course, and as a way of sort of widening the focus of their degrees. The breadth of the disciplines in the module team has been really enriching for all of us who teach on it, not least because each of these disciplines has been engaged in their own decolonial debates in recent years, though I look forward to learning more from you all about this, but my impression is, especially in relation to French studies, where I come from, it's actually German studies that seems to be sort of much further ahead than most. And while putting together this module, I was very inspired by the studies that have come out about Black Germans most recently, and modules on Black Germany at places like UCL. So, as well as our module content, we also prioritise a decolonial approach in our assessment and aim through this module and other modules to train decolonial researchers who will take the skills that they've learned in Black Europe and in other modules across the school to influence their approaches in other parts of their studies, and most especially in the final year dissertation that's now obligatory for all our students. Excuse me. We teach the concepts of inclusive citation right from the beginning of the module. When they start in about a fortnight with me, that's in lecture 1. So we ask students to reflect explicitly on inclusive citation in both pieces of their assessment, which is a literature review and a final essay. Still feel quite uncomfortable about the form of that assessment, but that's something to think about in the future, and I would be keen on your thoughts on that. So for some students, this concept of inclusive citation can feel a bit like an uphill struggle, as they've been so conditioned to worry obsessively about concepts of reliability above all else when they examine sources to do preparation work or for assessment. It can take so long to unpick the idea that neutrality and reliability is often applied exclusively to Western, white, male academics from prestigious universities. That, you know, neutrality, reliability isn't either neutral or reliable. We encourage them to seek input not just from a wider range of academic sources and voices, but also those from community actors, from bloggers, from journalists. And this takes time and effort, both on our part and theirs, but is particularly welcomed by students from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. As the module progresses, there are increasingly interesting debates in class about who has access to publishing industries, academic or other, and about how new technologies might both highlight but also drown out previously and continually marginalised voices. Oh, sorry, I've just got overexcited and got to scroll down too much. As a middle-aged, middle-class lecturer, there is much, in mostly subtle, eye-rolling from the students about my knowledge, or lack of, social media, musical artists and influencers, and they're terribly worried that I get offended by bad language in the sources they quote. But this has highlighted my own unconscious bias and knowledge sphere, which is often an uncomfortable process, but I believe that we must all be willing to put ourselves on the line as academics and be open about our positionality, our background, and our approaches in the past and present to our discipline, if we're going to encourage students to do the same. And we do work a lot with students on making their own positionality explicit in their writing, and working with them to consider how their positionality does and should influence the way they gather and present their own evidence and arguments. And that is where I'm really pleased when I get to read those final essays. I can really see that journey that they've come on. So, although we introduce the students to a wide range of topics on the module, from modern issues, Black Muslim men in the UK and Black environmentalism, to the more historical Black populations into war in Nazi Germany, and go right back to the concept of race in ancient Greece, we encourage students to follow their own particular interests when they write their literature reviews and their essays. And this allows those who are less confident or even maybe less engaged, and of course there are always some, to start from familiar ground in terms of that topic and apply the decolonial research principles that we've taught them. For other students, especially those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, such a free choice allows them the space to explore their own identity, their own interests and causes that are dear to their hearts in a way that often traditional academia rarely makes time for until final year or postgraduate study. And I've learnt so much from these essays, and we'll be inviting one of the past students back to share her work on Afrofeminist digital spaces in France with this year's cohort in a paid capacity, of course, and that's something that I'm always on my hobby horse on about at Leeds, about not asking students, especially minoritized students, to give up their time for free. So those are kind of the positives, the things I think that we do really well. While writing this paper, I sat down and thought about the issues that there are with the module and how that might reflect on issues around decolonising modern languages more generally. The biggest issue for me is that there's only 2 non-white lecturers on the course. So that 2/3 of this module is delivered by white lecturers to a nearly 50% white group of students. As white lecturers teaching on race, we must continue to work hard to reflect our own positionality, to check our biases, and most importantly, to create safe spaces for study and debate for our minoritized students. The composition of our teaching team was, talks a lot about what the situation is at Leeds, but also highlights the need for positive action across modern languages nationally. And I'm thinking particularly in the fields of PhD funding, and reports from organisations like Leading Roots have highlighted how few Black students are given PhD funding every year. But it also tells us much about the recruitment procedures across UK universities. It also raises the issue of the pressure placed on academics from minoritized groups, especially those working in decolonial studies, to contribute to all modules in this field, leading to burnout, delayed promotions and sidelinings, and eventually sometimes as well decisions to leave academia. And our disciplinary associations must, associations must commission and publish research into this demographic composition of our academic body. And I'm thinking particularly about reports from the Royal Historical Society over the previous years, who really looked at questions around teaching of history in UK universities and who's teaching it and who's studying it. And I think that we could really do with something similar in modern languages. Another related issue that I'm grappling with as module leader is how to ensure fair access to this module, as this module always reaches its number cap within the first 30 minutes of online enrolment. So what extent does this disadvantage students who have to work, and especially this year, who have had more limited access to reliable internet connections? I really believe that Black students should be offered priority enrolment to this module, but I haven't as yet found a mechanism to do this. For both practical and also ideological reasons, there's a certain squeamishness in university administration about prioritising certain student groups for module enrolment. However, I hope that wider debates about degree awarding gaps and action plans to address them, which I'm very heavily involved with at Leeds, might help move this issue along. And I'd be really keen to hear examples of where such priority access has become standard practice in your universities. And the final issue is how we leave enough time in a curriculum in a module such as Black Europe to examine current affairs and important issues that occur during the year. We had covered issues of police violence towards Black populations in France in January of this year, when reading work by Aïssa Traoré, whose brother Adama was unlawfully killed by police in Greater Paris in 2016. Yet because of assessment and because of lockdown, most of our response to the murder of George Floyd and the global Black Lives Matter protests had to be done outside the classroom via a module Twitter account or virtual learning environment. And this is something that I need to do, and we need to do better next year. So in conclusion, this module has highlighted the importance of overturning the modern languages syllabus instead of making small changes around the edges. It provides a space for students, especially from minoritized groups, to debate issues that link directly to the world in which they live, and provides them with new academic tools to approach their studies. It also sends a really important message to students and to the university alike that our discipline needs to change. However, this module is, and in fact must necessarily be, a work in progress. True decolonisation of our curricula will never be finished. Indeed, as we enter a new academic year when so much attention will rightly be devoted to developing quality online teaching, we must ensure that this does not simply fall back on old tropes, but instead is an opportunity to further reassess our goals for a decolonial education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nina, for that very rich and fascinating presentation. I have lots of questions already, but we're going to pass straight on to Fozia, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end of the session. That's okay. So Fozia Bora is Associate Professor in Middle Eastern and Islamic History at the University of Leeds, and I believe she is now sharing the screen. And today she's going to talk about silenced knowledge and the decolonial classroom, case studies from the Middle East. I'll hand over to you, Fozia.
Thank you so much. A big thanks firstly to Joe, to Emmanuel and the organising team for really hosting this online conference. I was able to attend much of yesterday and found incredibly valuable and rich in terms of ideas and practices. I've kind of framed this particular talk, in fact you'll see a lot of parallels with what Nina talked about, and Nina, I really enjoyed your paper, and the reason for that is because we actually work together on some of these ideas and have a chance to have conversations around this in the past through various projects, so there is a little bit of overlap, but my particular kind of point of departure is kind of letting colleagues here into my kind of classroom experience teaching Middle Eastern history and Islamic history at the University of Leeds. So I kind of wanted to frame this by talking about kind of how we open the conversations around kind of colonially underpinned knowledge, how students can kind of sort of move away from those structures, and then the questions that still remain, because as Nina mentioned, this is an ongoing process. You never really reach the end, which in one sense is dissatisfying, but in another sense is quite liberating, because it's not something that that has kind of an end point. In other words, you're free to keep doing this as you see appropriate and as you find useful. So I've titled my talk "Silenced Knowledge and the Decolonial Classroom," with sort of, there should be scare quotes really around some of these terms: decolonial, knowledge, and so on, and even Middle East. I'll come to that shortly. So I'll first sort of set the scene. The two modules that I'm going to be speaking about in particular are a first year module on Islamic history and a second year module on Middle Eastern history. Now, although we're a School of Languages, primarily, that's what we mostly teach, we also teach quite a lot of humanities modules alongside. I mean, I shouldn't really say it's mainly languages. Actually, we do these things kind of in a kind of structurally enmeshed way. In other words, languages in context. So that's where these modules come in. Students of Arabic, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies will typically take these modules. They are often students who will go on a year abroad to Morocco or to Jordan to learn Arabic. So the Islamic history module is before the year abroad, and the modern Middle Eastern history module is after the year abroad. So they have that experience in between of being in the Arab world. These modules are taught over 20 weeks, so sort of 2 semesters. So that's sort of effectively one academic year. And the assessment structure is via a series of critical reviews or essays, seminar presentations, and I'm trying to set up a reflective learning log to replace some of these summative assessments, but COVID-19 has sort of thrown a spanner in the works, so I've not been able to change the assessment structure. In addition, we are launching this year, Nina has been involved with this, a new level 3 module on decolonial approaches, which is an initiative that we took with the feeling that students who are doing final year projects need something dedicated on methodologies of decolonial research. So that's kind of where we are in terms of kind of the pedagogic context. So when we kind of open the conversation in Middle Eastern history and Islamic history about decolonial approaches and about sources and about their experience of studying these topics, I kind of introduced topics, sort of terms like decoloniality quite early on. And I think I might have missed a slide, excuse me a second. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we begin with a kind of a period of reflection on the terms we use and the structures that these suggest, the frameworks they suggest, and whether we can do anything about the kind of the harmful nature of some of these frameworks. So we begin with ideas about knowledge and research, what counts as research, what counts as knowledge, what do we admit into the academy as reliable and usable knowledge. We also question periodization. We question the ideas of modernity as a hugely, kind of influential turning point, and then the kind of related terms pre-modern, postmodern. That periodization, again, it's Eurocentric, of course, it's hegemonic, but it's also fairly difficult to get away from. And so we have an explicit discussion about how we can decenter that periodization in any meaningful way. The module title is still Modern Middle Eastern History, so we haven't been able to kind of completely get away from it. I mean, we will, because we haven't really decided what should come instead, but it's an ongoing discussion. We also question terms like Middle East, Near East, Far East. Again, these are highly Eurocentric terms, and students respond extremely positively to these discussions. For them, this is kind of why they're at university, to question the frameworks of knowledge, as well as sort of expanding their kind of own horizons on particular topics and languages. And so we kind of ask the question, are we hostages to the structures of language and the terminologies of language, and also to the framing that these terms suggest? And we talk about how you could kind of reduce the impact of these framings and to find alternative ways to frame their studies, distancing devices, so things like Middle East, kind of putting it in scare quotes, and think about other ways of defining that part of the world, whether it's the Arabic-speaking world, the Islamic world. And these terms are fuzzy; their boundaries are extremely, kind of undefined or undefinable. We think about using alternative terms that come from source languages. I mean, with the term Middle East in the Arab world, you have Sharq al-Awsat, which is a kind of a translation of that term, which is unfortunate because, in other words, that framing is being reproduced. But then you can think about the ways in which Middle Eastern societies defined themselves before the imposition of this kind of language. So these kind of questions come up for students, and they really seem to respond well to these discussions. We also ask at the start of these modules, what is the point of having a so-called decolonial approach? What does it mean? What does it help us to kind of appreciate about the regions that we study and their histories? I kind of begin with sort of I begin with a radical conversation about what do we actually want to do? What are our endpoints, our end goals? Are we aiming to kind of, make the university a more inclusive space, have more diverse reading lists? Or really, are we thinking about how universities are bastions of power, of resources, and how do we redistribute some of that power, some of those resources, and have an impact outside of academia and link with activism? And students tend to, there's a variety of responses, but they tend to like the explicit reflexivity of those discussions. And we also talk about epistemology. And epistemological reflexivity is something that I find students undergraduate level and postgraduate level really find to be valuable. And if we have that discussion early on, that kind of sets the scene for them to then discuss sources, discuss methodologies and their topics in a fairly reflexive way. So that's kind of the starting point for these modules. I'm going to move now to a couple of case studies of where we, students and I, have had a chance to think about non-traditional approaches to sources, non-traditional in the sense of kind of decentering the kind of conventional academic discourses on these topics. So when we look at the journey of Morocco to independence after the French protectorate, we look at a important book by Jonathan Wirdson called Making Morocco, Colonial Intervention in the Politics of Identity, where he has very valuably collected the oral accounts of Berbers, of Jewish communities, and of women in colonial era Morocco, kind of gathered and sort of organized by the Berber Bureau and the Arab Bureau. These are colonial bureaus, which have both an administrative function but also a knowledge gathering function. And in using these archives, students have a fairly ambiguous journey. On the one hand, it's really valuable for them to be able to see the words and ideas and responses to colonialism of Berber communities, of Jews as a minority, and of women. That's extremely helpful to them in kind of building a story of the ways in which this nation building activity took place and what the nuances of that were. On the other hand, it also raises a quite difficult question, which we all as teachers and as students have to grapple with, which is that often our source bases are built in a colonial era, particularly with this archive or archives. The men collecting this evidence were European colonial officers, and so in that sense they're constructing a body of knowledge, and we rely on their construction of that knowledge in order to access these indigenous voices. So that kind of mediation is highly problematic. So we talk about the ambiguities of that situation and how students can sort of, yes, make use of the archive, but also question its provenance and the ways in which it throws an ambiguity back on themselves and how they then negotiate that in their own writings and in their own grappling with the subject matter of this topic. I'll move on now next onto a topic that we cover in Islamic history, which is the historiographical reliability of hadith. Now, hadith, for those of you who don't know, are the sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam. And this is a kind of huge corpus of sayings which were written down 150 years after they were kind of uttered. And there's been a huge kind of movement within Oriental studies to over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries to talk about this corpus as unreliable and as a kind of a projection of later Islamic imperialists onto a kind of a so-called golden age of the formative period of Islam. In other words, this body of writings has been subject to wholesale denigration by early generations of Orientalists. So for students, this raises a bit of a question, because if you dismiss a whole body of, indigenous sources, and then what then, what does that mean for the field? Is that fair? Is it helpful? What do you replace those materials with? Do we have alternative accounts from the same era? So we kind of talk about the importance of these sources, these hadith texts, for Muslim communities today as a source of ethics, of law, of metaphysics, of spiritual practice, and so on. And then we talk about the fact that these sources were actually subjected to critique even at their time of composition. In other words, there was an internal process of assessing their reliability in the medieval period. And this is really not emphasized in the Orientalist critique. Again, it's it's the story of colonial era knowledge formation in which indigenous voices are either silenced or denigrated. So students have an opportunity to reflect on that. Bear in mind also that within a cohort of, say, 50 students who are coming in to study Islamic history, and that has been a typical number, 2 or 3 will have a seminary background where they've been to a Muslim seminary to study hadith from a devotional perspective. So the message that body of literature is unreliable and should be thrown out is very problematic for them. So what we try to do in the module is talk about valid critiques of all sources, including the hadith, but also the ways in which we mustn't reproduce Orientalist tropes and Orientalist methodologies in assessing this body of sources and its historiographical value. So that's kind of one aspect of using hadith in Islamic history. But then we also look at whether this body of writings has its own inequalities, and it clearly does, the way it talks about women. So often it will emphasize the agency of women and the freedom of women, but on the other hand, there are, in the hadith, it's a very vast corpus. You'll see voices which limit women's agency as well. So we talk about the ways in which our decolonial readings need to address these multifaceted hegemonic aspects and these ways in which they're problematic from many different points of view, the patriarchy, and also the fact that it's been framed through an Orientalist kind of reading over the kind of 20th century and into the 21st. So that's the kind of second case study of teaching Islamic and Middle Eastern history here at Leeds, and how students kind of get into some of the debates around the knowledge systems that we inherit and how we might work both with them and against them. So I'm going to move now on to sort of where we get to when we have these discussions. What do these these case studies lead to? What kind of conversations do they facilitate? So with both of these case studies, they lead to sort of reflections on the epistemic violence of Orientalism. So it was both a construction of knowledge and a silencing of knowledge. We talk about a very interesting question for students is post-colonial kind of critiques have been around for a long time, for many decades. What have they given us and what have they failed to give us? So we talk about the limits of the post-colonial critique. I mean, we talk about Edward Said, we talk about Guy Spivak, we talk about Frantz Fanon, and all of these extremely important figures and what they have lent to our disciplines. But we also talk about Walter Mignolo and the more recent schools of decoloniality and the distinctions between post-colonial and decolonial thinking. We talk about the fact that a decolonial framework is not as time-bound as the post-colonial approach seems to be. It's about the kind of hegemonies of knowledge making in the long view, not simply before and after formal colonialism began and ended. And we talk about whether academic work should be explicitly linked to activism outside of the academy. I mean, our kind of starting point for a lot of decolonial work has been the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the movement in South Africa, and then here in Oxford and other places. And there, the link between activists outside of academia and academics has been more explicit, and students tap into those debates and want to see how we address them and where do we stand as academics on these debates. And I, you know, me and other colleagues like myself, like Nina, like Stephan and others, we do encourage students to question the very frameworks in which universities, you know, kind of approach knowledge and prioritize particular types of knowledge. And we talk explicitly about how to de-universalize European epistemologies in the way that Nina described earlier. And for example, obsession with documentation. What about cultures that don't document in a conventional way? Does that mean they don't have knowledge? And then we talk about decolonizing as distinct from diversifying, and as I mean, in some ways, diversification I see as a kind of a smokescreen, a way to not really tackle the root causes of colonial era knowledge construction, which still permeates our areas of study. So I'm going to now kind of talk about the problems with our discussions and the risks associated with them, even though these are rich and fruitful discussions, and students are always amazing and wonderful in the way they respond, and they always have so many insights to bring. And this is students of all backgrounds. Nevertheless, we still have to grapple with some quite uncomfortable truths, some of which I present here. One is the compromised nature of our knowledge pathways in general. You can't really get away from some of these framings very effectively. What you can do is be explicit about your positionality within them and to question that framing, but finding alternatives is another whole challenge, which neither I nor students have necessarily found a way to effectively deal with. I guess it's an ongoing discussion, an ongoing process, and I find that I'm doing that in my research as well as in my teaching. And again, and students also are doing that, you know, in an ongoing way. One problem that's particularly obvious to me from listening to students is that when you present a decolonial approach as one of a number of available approaches, that kind of devalues it, because it's a sort of the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of approaches, just pick the one that most speaks to you. That's not really, I would say, effective in dismantling the kind of the hegemonic structure of the way in which we approach knowledge in Middle Eastern studies and in Islamic studies. So we talk about how we might wish to take a kind of a kind of long-term view and go beyond the idea that this is a marketplace of approaches. And students are actually fantastic because they apply some of this thinking. Well, they're getting this input and they're bringing their own insights on this conversation, and they apply this to all levels of study. You know, I mean, they have many opportunities in the School of Languages and Cultures and Societies to have these kinds of conversations. Obviously, there's a lot more work to be done, but you know, there are modules and lecturers who who make a point of centering these discussions, and students then apply this thinking to their other studies. So, for example, I had a student who was doing French and English. She was from a Tunisian background, and she said to me that for the first time in her degree, she felt that she found a home for her thinking and for her kind of particular intellectual needs. And then she took what we did in this module, this modern Middle Eastern history, and she took some of that thinking to the English side of her degree, where there is work on post-colonialism, but it's not framed, at least it wasn't then framed, in a decolonial way. And it was really heartening to get her email about how this made her feel like she had a place on her degree course for the first time. That was really nice to hear. One of the difficulties is that finding alternative bodies of sources, alternative archives, alternative oral kind of testimonies and so on for the study of colonial era history is a labor-intensive task. And often, people like me don't have the resources or the time to give it the attention and time it deserves. So really, I think a collective effort on this would be amazing. And I'd love to hear from colleagues about how we might share resources, how we might share ideas about how to open up new channels of discovery and investigation for the study of these histories, but really for any discipline. Okay, I'm going to I think I'm going to skip ahead slightly. So I've talked about students and their positive responses for the most part. The questions that we raise in the modules, which of course they're also raising in other modules, like the ones taught by Nina and Stephan and others, they seem to allow students to do some quite joined up thinking around what inclusive education might be, and about how we might wish to invest collectively, the collective we, as in they and us together, might want to invest in their future as academics, but also as thinkers and as people who contribute to society in a huge variety of ways. And they are often, their questions are around what's the role of universities in perpetuating inequality. And I think that's a very good line of thinking for them to have, because some of them will be our future academics, our future researchers, and for them to have that kind of mode of thinking at this stage, I think is extremely positive and bodes well for the future. Yeah, so that's kind of some of the epistemic self-realizations that students seem to undergo along their journeys. The kind of upshot of all of our discussions is kind of, I've called it liberation of knowledges, and there is some of that does happen, and that's sort of a slightly pompous way of putting it, but it does feel for students empowering to have these reflexive discussions. Still, we do, collectively realize that there is so much that we still have to grapple with and can't do very easily. One of those issues is the colonial gatekeeping of research. So our teaching in the school tends to be research-led. And in research, you see various issues that, Nina alluded to this, the politics of citation. How much are women, are ethnic minorities, indigenous voices cited? How effectively are they cited? And this is, the academic system has its own ways of perpetuating inequalities and to center the kind of the white voice, the male voice, the heterosexual voice, the colonial voice, if you like. And I think it's actually quite difficult to overturn those norms single-handedly. I think it requires a movement. We also have the issue that, publication is one of our kind of holy grails, to publish rigorous, original, peer-reviewed research. But all of those values, that they should be subjectivized, what we call rigorous, what we call significant, what we call, what we call kind of worthy of peer review, of positive peer review. All of these processes are self-perpetuating, and in many ways we're encouraged to take them for granted, because it's a system that's constructed to reproduce itself. Really what we're up against is a kind of the huge infrastructure of research publication and the kind of values inherent within that system. So then one of the questions that remains for me, for our students, for all of us working in these with these conversations and with this kind of framing in mind, is how can we as academic activists work outside of this system? Can we work effectively outside of this system? Or should we be trying to decreate it from within? Is that even a possibility? And what really are the kind of priorities in our work as researchers and as teachers? Where do we begin to think about how to change the system, and perhaps even to replace it with something that's radically fairer and more appreciative of the vast ranges of knowledges that we could draw on if we had the resources to do so. I think I'll end there. I'd be delighted to hear from colleagues about their thoughts and their kind of, approaches to these, and also particularly their ways of sharing resources, if they have any suggestions and tips on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fozia. That's, again, a really rich and fascinating presentation. I'm going to move straight on to Stephan, and then we'll come to the Q&A at the end. So Stephan Petzold is a lecturer in German history at the University of Leeds, and today Stephan's speaking to us about decolonizing the German curriculum at Leeds. So I'll pass right over to you, Stephan, if I may.
Yep. Thank you. I'm just share. Is this working?
We can see your slides. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. So some of the themes that Nina and Fozia have already talked about are themes that are already coming up in my presentation. And also some of the things that were mentioned in the panels yesterday. So what I'm going to do, and the title kind of suggests that, is that I'm going to talk about what we've done in way of decolonizing the curriculum in German at Leeds. I'm not trying to present this as a kind of success story. And as many people have said before, it's a process. It's not really anywhere where you reach a kind of theological endpoint. So it's really about sharing what we've done, offer some reflections, some of the challenges that we still have, things that still need to be done. And I'll first start talking about kind of the process we've done, sort of a kind of broader outlook. Then I'll talk in particular about two modules, two first-year modules, to give you a bit more insight into what we've done and our thinking around it. Talk then briefly about assessment and the role that assessments can play in the decolonizing. And then at the end, offer some reflections, challenges, and quite a lot of those have actually been mentioned by previous speakers. Okay, so a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, we started thinking about what do we want to do with our curriculum. We wanted to kind of have a root and branch review of the curriculum, and there were several aims in decolonizing the curriculum as part of a broader diversifying of the curriculum. And I very much note the point that Fozia just made about the kind of tension between decolonizing and diversifying, and the kind of problematic link between those. So it was really the idea to make sure that marginalized voices are represented adequately and kind of embedded in the curriculum. It's also, and I think that's part of that in some way, it's not just about topics and what we as tutors decide to, what topics we include, but also to empower students to take control of their own learning, that they can set the agenda for their own learning. As both Nina and Fozia have already mentioned, in Leeds, our students across the university have to do a final year project. So we have a responsibility to develop students' research skills right from the start. And something finally that's very close to my heart is to kind of rethink, not necessarily rethink cultural studies, but to have a multidisciplinary cultural studies approach. So where we where we don't prioritize privileged particular source types such as literature or other expressions of high culture, or so-called high culture, but also give space to low culture to really reflect the diversity of contemporary German-speaking culture. Okay, so then what do we do? Our approach this kind of is presented here now as more systematic than it probably was in reality. But as I already said, this is part of a root and branch curriculum review that we started with our year one, and that reform of year one we started 2 years ago. One thing that was really crucial for us, and certainly crucial for me, was a focus on collaboration, so that this was really a team effort, where I've learned a lot from my colleagues, in particular Helen Finch, Ingrid Sharp, but also that quite a lot of our curriculums or many of the modules are taught as a team, or by smaller teams, rather than individual colleagues having their own their own module. And really, it's about rethinking the program. It's about rethinking modules. It's about rethinking the content that's covered within modules. It's also, as already hinted at, with the rethinking of assessments and the role that plays, and the rethinking of teaching styles. And even in my presentation, I'll be talking a lot about the content that we cover, but I think it's quite important to see the selection of content as part of a kind of wider rethinking of the curriculum. One thing that we've introduced or started in the spring this year was a diversifying the German curriculum, or decolonizing the German curriculum reading group, and really that should read decolonizing, because the focus was on decolonizing. And there were some really interesting kind of points that came out of that discussion that we hadn't really looked at. So one point really was, we need to look at the program as a whole. Many of our students are joint honours students, so the space they have in their programs to study German is relatively limited. And so kind of introducing separate modules with a focus on decolonizing is obviously really useful, but it then depends on the choice of modules the students make. And we really kind of realized that it has to be embedded across the curriculum, and that highlighted in particular the importance of including core language modules in this. And so I'm really interested in some of the panels that talk about decolonizing language teaching, language learning in this, because they are obviously the modules that all students take. There's also something that came out of this, the challenge of the year abroad, and how we can support students there when we have relatively limited kind of access to them, if you like. So yeah, there was just some interesting points that came out. We haven't solved them in any way, but yeah, there were just points that we need to work on a lot more. One thing that I had already planned and already had conversations with Nina about this is that we would quite like to do an inclusivity and diversity audit for our modules, which would include the decolonization. And one thing I've realized in the last couple of years, or even longer, is the importance of institutional support and networks. So having like-minded colleagues to share ideas, to bounce off ideas, to benefit from resources that already exist. I find that incredibly beneficial, and I think it's really important to strengthen those kinds of networks, largely informal, but also some more formal ones. And I think, I don't want to blow my own trumpet too much here, but I think it's also quite important to have leadership, that leaders within subject areas, within schools, universities, keep putting the topic on the agenda and make sure that it doesn't go away, but that it's a kind of recurring engagement with those kinds of questions. And one thing that I think many of us in the German team have realized is that it really requires also a change in our mentality, our self-image, perhaps, and how we see the relationship between learners and tutors, and the kind of greater role that needs to be given to learners, where we might also have to give up some of the kind of, I don't know, the sort of knowledge and privileges, perhaps. And that's really exciting in many ways, but is a longer and quite complex process. Okay, so one thing I wanted to briefly mention is a text by Amanda Randall, and this quote in particular, because I thought it really highlights the challenge, the kind of more fundamental intellectual challenge, that decolonizing isn't just about adding or replacing cultural text, as she says here in the second line, but it's really, in line 4, that it demands a paradigmatic shift consisting in a new set of intended learning outcomes and organizing frameworks, etc. So it's really this kind of the diversifying, decolonizing, decentering of a kind of broader understanding of, in our case, what German culture, German identity might be, to really challenge, decenter, ethno-nationalist conceptions of Germanness. And I'm not suggesting we've kind of done it and we can tick that box. Not that it's a box ticking exercise anyway, but that, yeah, it's, I think, something that is really important and useful to think about. Okay, so what have we done in the way we reformed the curriculum in German at Leeds? So we started, as I've already said, with year 1 2 years ago. We introduced a new core module, German 1080, Research, German Culture, History and Society, and then reformed a history module that is an option for students on top of that, obviously in addition to the language modules. And then last year we introduced a suite of new modules in the second year. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but you also see the Black Europe module that Nina's talked about. So what I'm going to talk about now in a little bit more detail is the 2 first year modules. The first one, 1080, which is a new module, but then also talk a bit about the challenges of redesigning an existing module, and that I've personally found quite difficult to kind of liberate yourself from what you taught before. Okay, so 1080 is taught by 4 learning units. The first one focuses on questions of national identity, construction, the focus on how identities, ideas of Germanness are constructed, and also in the link with memory, German memory culture. Second unit is on borders and migration. Third unit, gender and sexuality. Fourth unit, power control and protest. And the topics, each unit consists of 4 weeks, 4 topics. And I've put the ones here on the slide that have some element of also try to work towards a decolonizing and integrate non-white voices in one way or another. The topics that are marked with an asterisk are those where the kind of decolonizing was added for the coming academic year, and I want to make clear through that really this idea that it's a process and that we're learning ourselves and trying to rethink what we've done and try to broaden that out and kind of really embedding it more thoroughly in the curriculum. I'm not going to go into all of these in any great detail, but to just pick a few. So the very first topic, racializing Germanness, is where we look at colonial texts, a colonial popular magazine, and really look at how Germans became increasingly white and how national identity became increasingly constructed as white and therefore being racialized. In the unit borders and migration, I don't think I have to talk too much about this because it's quite clear by its very title. One thing I want to highlight is where we look at, it's a point that Elizabeth made yesterday, the kind of way we frame and how we talk about migration, that can be quite problematic in some ways. And one thing we do here is we include under post-war migrations the so-called expellees, so ethnic Germans that lived in Eastern Europe and resettled or were resettled around the end of the Second World War. And what I quite like about this is that we talk about migration not as something that is only a phenomenon that involves non-white people. Okay, gender and sexuality in that unit, the Korean Reunited Berlin topic looks at a film that looks at German-Turkish homosexual relations or relationships. And the second topic there is where we look at a very recent novel by Olivia Wenzel, an East German, a Black East German, and look at the kind of constructions of gender, experiences of racism in that very recent novel. And then finally, that we'll talk about how the debate over Black Lives Matter, the representation of the Black Lives Matter protests this year, how that was represented in German and Austrian popular television. Then I want to briefly talk about the other module that that existed and was kind of redesigned slightly, and it's something where over the last year tried to make it more diverse, to start at least decolonizing it, mainly through making non-white, but also other marginalized voices and experiences more visible, in particular in the kinds of voices and the kind of texts that we, kind of primary sources that we study. And one thing that I found really interesting is how much that actually, even some quite small changes, changed the dominant textbook narratives about German history in terms of what kinds of topics we're talking about, but also have a polyvocality and so kind of plural voices exploring topics through different eyes, different perspectives. And to give you an example of this, which kind of surprised me myself when I researched it a little bit more, is how much the kind of existing narrative and also the perception that students have, the existing knowledge that students have, changes when you start decolonizing it. So if we look at the 1989 revolution in East Germany and the process of German reunification, and that's quite widely seen, was widely seen at the time, but also in some of the historical research as a kind of moment of national enthusiasm. That was kind of a glorious moment. The German nation is coming together. It's seen as a time of opportunity, in particular for East Germans, to experience newfound freedoms, and also some discussion around a return to some sort of nation state normality. And this is very much a white narrative that focuses on the experience of white West and white East Germans. And when you start to include some non-white voices, that really changes the story, because we see some other things that happen at the same time. So there's exclusion. Non-white Germans and non-Germans are pretty much invisible from our kinds of perceptions of the revolution and reunification. There is very soon after the wall fell, there are increased incidents that are reported by, in particular, East German, Black East Germans, or sort of called contract workers. And also the increased anxieties felt by migrant communities, Black German communities in both East and West about the future, whether that new reunified Germany, what that might mean for their future in Germany. So it's really interesting how this narrative around a kind of enthusiastic embrace of a new nation state looks really quite different if we include non-white voices. Okay, as I said, I want to briefly talk a little bit about assessment as well and the role that that can play. So it's something we had in German at Leeds had already started a while ago, is to move away from the traditional essay exam diet of assessments and move away from tutor-centered assessment formats and questions, really as part of this process of empowering students to take the lead, to give them more choice over the work, the research, and the assessments that they complete, and where they can choose topics that they want to research further. It also helps in practicing and embedding student autonomy, and it's crucial for us because of the final year project. It develops research skills, and we're doing that from day one, or at least year one. So we've already done that for many years for our language modules through autonomous language learning portfolios, where students pick tasks and sort of match different text types, different ideas, different topics that they want to write about. In the new or relatively new core first year module, Germ 1080, that I talked about a few minutes ago, the assessment is done entirely through a group research project. That students also present at a conference, and it's students in a group of 4 or 5 choose a kind of bigger topic they want to research, and then each member of the group researches a subtopic that contributes something to the overall project idea. In the 20th century German history module I've just talked about, one of the assessments is an imagined autobiography, which I'm myself quite surprised by how well that's worked. It's where students kind of try to put themselves, they create an imagined person that lives in Germany after 1945, and they pick a number of key events, developments, and write about that after having done research on how kind of credible that account might be. And it's really fascinating. It's really a way where also students can kind of write that more diverse experience for them, and many of them have actually done that, much more than what the module covers. And in the second and final year, the students design on pretty much all German modules, design their own essay questions, design their own group projects, and obviously come up with ideas for their final year projects. Okay, to not really conclude, but to kind of end on some reflections and challenges, and as I already said, quite a few of these have been mentioned by earlier speakers. So one thing I found, it's incredibly rewarding. It also takes a lot of time and effort, more than I had perhaps somewhat naively imagined. But my own learning process and the kind of learning progress was really quite something that I really enjoyed, in addition, obviously, to the knowing that we're doing the right thing for all kinds of reasons. One thing that's been mentioned before, and I'm just highlighting it, is a process. It's something you can't do in one go, but this will take a lot of time for tutors themselves to kind of decolonize their own views, their own approach to teaching, etc. One thing that I find as a challenge, something I've also through that have become aware a little bit more, is the kind of challenge of sort of the processes, dynamics of how knowledge is constituted, canonized, and circulated. And so we see that through textbooks. If you want to decolonize a history module, it's quite challenging because you won't find many textbooks that do what you would like them to do. There's also a question of the availability of resources, and in particular, if you're interested in periods from the 20th century or before, that libraries might not hold certain texts that were published in the 1970s, 1980s, because they weren't canonical at the time. They're not canonical now, but they simply don't exist, or getting hold of them is quite difficult. But also for languages, we don't currently have an ab initio pathway in German at Leeds, but if you have, and we're hopefully going to have, a beginner's pathway soon, then you need texts in translation, and that reinforces, or we're kind of reliant on the structures of the UK or the Anglophone publishing market in terms of what texts are actually being translated, what authors are being translated, and translating some texts yourself is obviously quite time consuming. So I think in that sense, it's this kind of complex and difficult kind of dependence on publishing markets and existing resources. Then one thing that I think Nina and Fozia also mentioned this is kind of thinking about what is the best, or what is a good way, what is an effective way to decolonize without falling into the tokenism trap. So as Nina said at the start of her presentation, this quite common criticism of, okay, we have race week or we have migration week, and how can we avoid that? So is it really thinking about offering separate modules, offering separate units within modules, offering separate topics? Is it about integrating of marginalized voices in existing topics, or really a more fundamental rethinking of how that might be integrated? And it's not that I have an answer to this, but I think it's just something quite interesting to think about. Then one thing, it's a point Elizabeth made already in her presentation yesterday, that decolonizing cannot be limited to including migration, because it sort of pigeonholes the position of migrants as something not quite belonging to that ethno-nationalist idea of Germany or Austria, in our case. The one thing I've also found really important, and more so than I would have expected, is the importance of scaffolding and transparency. So explaining to students why we're doing this. So it happens very rarely, but sometimes there are criticism where students say, oh, the curriculum is so woke. And I think perhaps we need to explain that this isn't about any kind of wokeness as such, but it's explaining the rationale why this is important, and the kind of social justice kind of position behind it as well. So really to not just integrate different voices, but also think about within modules, within units, within programs perhaps even, how that can be embedded and scaffolded properly. What I've also found a little bit different, but I think is important, is to be also quite transparent about your own learning as a tutor, or say my own learning and my positionality as a tutor, being open about this is a learning process for me, which can also help in changing that hierarchical relationship between students and tutors. And then finally, is the point that's been also made before, it's the how credible can we decolonize if it's done by exclusively white staff. And in the German team at Leeds, we are exclusively white, mainly middle-aged. So yeah, how credible can we decolonize if it's done by white tutors? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephan. Again, brilliant talk. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to open it straight to questions from the audience, if I may. Please, as we did yesterday, raise your hand, raise your digital hand, or comment in the chat, and we can all see the comments. Or if you'd like to ask an anonymous question, then please direct it to me, and then I can ask the panelists the question. I have lots of questions myself, but I mean, especially perhaps I'll just use chair's privilege before we go to questions. What Fozia said about the student feedback that she had, that student who said, this is the first time I felt at home in a kind of discipline, or perhaps she didn't use that term, but first time she felt at home in the university. I just wondered to what extent then, and you were comparing it to her experience in English, I just wondered to what extent, languages and departments of languages are unique places where we can do this kind of work. And is that a kind of unique, I don't want to use the term selling point, but is that something that we can highlight for, and spoke about it yesterday briefly, about the recovery of modern languages and getting more students to study modern languages? And that's to all of you, really, but to Fozia perhaps in particular.
Sure, it's a very good question, Joe. I would say that there probably is a very good opportunity here, because we encourage students to learn languages, and that language gives us access to whole ranges of resources. And it's uniquely empowering for students to be able to, reach out for the media that's in Arabic or in German or whatever language we might be speaking about, and to interpret them and to incorporate that into their work and into their methodologies. I think what's challenging for me is that although language learning gives you access, the frameworks for interpretation, the approaches and methodologies that you use still need a lot of work, and we still need to support students in how to join up their thinking, when they embark on research projects or want to write their essays, or in my case, study history. So yes, I think it's the fact that we teach languages and the humanities surrounding language learning does provide, I would say, unique selling point to students, because we have that drive to broaden their horizons about kind of geographical spaces and so on. At the same time, we should also be mindful of the limitations of our approaches. And for example, if you're a human geographer, you will have particular approaches to do with social justice, and so on. That will be an imperative that in their field is perhaps more foregrounded than in ours. So I think every field has its avenues for decolonial thinking, but I certainly think we can exploit what we have in order to attract students to the value of languages and cultures as a means to understand the world in richer and more nuanced ways.
Fantastic, thank you, Fozia. Did any other panelists have a response to that, or shall I move on?
Yeah, I could. Sorry, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, Stephan.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So with this conversation, we had a conversation in the German team, and I kind of felt a little bit uncomfortable with talking about the kind of USP of doing it, because it kind of seems to be, we might be selling it as a marketing tool to attract students, and I don't think that's what it's about. It's about social justice. It's about fair representation, and so obviously, that it might help in some way or another. But the sort of if the narrative around us creating a USP for languages, I would feel bit uncomfortable with.
Yeah, thank you, Stephan. Yeah, I'm just gonna. We've got one hand up, and I'm going to. We've got two hands up. I'm going to ask Claire. Claire, you were first. Could you unmute? Can you unmute? I'll ask you to unmute.
Sorry, do you mean Claire or Clara?
Claire Louise Launchbury. Sorry,
Hello.
Clara. Claire, I can hear you.
You can hear me. Wonderful. Thank you. Can I just, I mean, I used to work at Leeds, so I know that curriculum. So first of all, congratulations on actually getting this stuff through, because I do understand how the institution can work and be a challenge actually structurally in getting this sort of thing off the ground. And I think there is so much to say because every single presentation was so rich, but I was very taken by so excuse me if I ramble because I might. I was very taken by Fozia's notion of what we do outside the academy as somebody with 1 foot and 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and it sort of spoke again to things that were said yesterday about commons, about sort of putting together a corpus of material that's used or usable both within and without the institutional framework of the university, which itself is problematic. And we've seen some of the resources from Wise, My Curriculum Wise, and the new Black University, which I think has been established recently. And from that, and it's kind of related to something that I have been discussing with people like Helen at Leeds, which is about curriculum of care and where care fits in with this decolonizing. So, and I think Nina mentioned about the burden that is often placed on minoritized students to represent themselves within this framework, and how do we decenter that? How do we ensure that that doesn't happen? How we're not making people work doubly hard and, you know, giving them extra labor to speak for things that they shouldn't have to, you know, that we should be making space for, rather than if that makes sense. So where does care come into that? And from a sort of background in therapeutic care of my own, you can think and look at things like solidarity practice and liberation psychology, which often give mechanisms for working with people in a way that is about decentering and dismantling the dyads, say, of therapist patients, which could potentially work in this sort of situation. And then my final point, sorry about this, is one of concern, and it's where we talk about research-led teaching, and I wonder where or how this thought fits with research council-led initiatives like the GCRF, which is actually quite neo-colonial. It's using UK state aid. It's, you know, DFID-led as was. So how do we sort of push back against that neo-colonial agenda, which is happening, and a lot of people are talking sort of neo-development speak. And I was just thinking also about how we're talking about, I work on Lebanon and Beirut, and we've been having a lot of discussions about how is it, what is our position here, looking into a situation there. So so I'm not sure if there's even a question there beyond how do we bring care? Where is care in all of this? And how do we ensure that through the marketization, through the necessity of getting funds, because that's how universities work, that we can still manage to push against some of these sort of rather negative and disturbing research agendas which undermine a lot of what we're doing.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. I'll open the floor to the panelists.
I think care has to be that very centre, doesn't it? And I think that we can be so focused on what topic we're going to teach and what mechanisms we're going to do. We've got to think of our colleagues and especially of the students, and realise that however much we want to break down those hierarchies of knowledge, that they do exist, and especially as they come into us in level 1, we've got to be very aware of what we're asking them to do and what support we're giving them, and how people experience the modules differently. And I think that's something that I'm learning a lot of, and about how we provide feedback in there, and how we how if we say you can choose your topic, that we really follow through on that. So I think that needs to be a lot more in quite rightly in how we envisage and how we put together our modules, thinking about those relationships with our students and with our colleagues too. Thank you, Claire. There are lots of interesting ideas in there.
Thanks, Nina. Did anyone else want to respond?
I mean,
Fozia?
yeah, thank you. I think one of the ways in which, just to add to what Nina said, and thank you, Claire, for the excellent questions. One of the ways in which we can, I find, take better care of our students is to give them opportunities for one-to-one discussion about their concerns and be good listeners. The problem is that university infrastructure doesn't support you with resources for much of that. So I think it's an ongoing challenge. I mean, you know, the students I've had for whom this has been a really empowering and important journey to acknowledge other kinds of resources, other approaches to knowledge, and you know, whether it's, you know, a student who did work on the Yoruba culture of her grandmother, or whatever it might be, to be able to sit with them and talk through the implications of what they're doing, the importance of what they're doing, the value it will add to the field, not just to their own personal journeys. I think it requires time, it requires investment. And that's where I think universities are failing students. They're not empowering us to have those deeper conversations necessarily. Now, that changes when you get to the final year and you have got your final year project, because we have a very robust system of kind of mentoring students through that process. Stephan is in charge of that in our school. And I think that relationship can work really, really well. But I still feel that universities have a lot more to do to build resources into the mentoring of students, particularly when it comes to the fraught topic of decolonizing. May I add just a point about research funding? One thing I've learned from a lot of experienced colleagues who think very critically about universities and neoliberalism and the kind of ultra-capitalist framework of our knowledge production is that thinking about research funding, not so much in terms of here is my research, how can I make an impact in the community and use funding to do that. Another approach is to say what's out there that needs support and how can I tailor my research and attract funding to support those projects. So I've been trying to do things that way more recently. And it's a way to, yes, we're in a framework where neoliberalism is the kind of the agenda of the day. If you look deeper, that's what you'll find. But nevertheless, I feel that we can actually attempt a redistribution of resources in our own limited ways to support particular projects. I think that could be a way to kind of overcome that particular structural kind of inequality.
Thank you, Fozia. I'm going to move on to I'm going to let Emmanuel ask a question, then I'll go through a couple of the questions in the chat, if I may. So I'm just, because we started a bit late, I'm just going to extend the question and answer session. I hope that's okay. Sorry, I missed out Rebecca. She's just reminding me there. Rebecca, do you want to come in quickly before Emmanuel? Rebecca Vince. Hello.
Yeah,
yes, hi. Thank you.
That was really great, thank you. I've always been impressed and inspired by what's going on at Leeds, ever since I went to a transnational Holocaust Studies conference there a while back. And I'm actually working with a colleague in German Studies with CBRL Council for British Research in the Levant in Jerusalem on a contested returns project. So yeah, just to say that was really inspiring. Anyway, my question is to Stephan about assessment, and I was intrigued to hear about the imagined autobiography idea, and I was wondering how you frame that in a way that avoids misappropriation or over-identification, focusing instead on cultivating empathy in students. Thanks so much.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I haven't really thought about it that much. That there is clearly there, but I think in the submissions that we've had, that happened very rarely, and so a very, very strong focus is on, so the students write the autobiography bit is 2,000 words, but they also have to write a 1,000 word academic rationale where they have to reference secondary literature so that they can demonstrate how the narrative they develop is based on academic research, how it's made credible, etc. And I think that kind of helps a little bit with that they accept the complexity of real people's lives. So that's one thing in the introduction of the assessment where we talk about don't don't construct the most coherent personal biography, because that's not real life. And yeah, allow for the complexity. It's one of the marking criteria as well, is that it's that it's realistic and credible. So sorry, that might not be a kind of direct answer to the question, but I don't think the issues appeared that often.
Really helpful, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stephan. So I'm just going to move on. Emanuele, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to thank all the speakers for these fabulous papers and this session that was really important for triggering ideas. I have one question for you, and again, I am so happy to hear that you at Leeds can get to do what you're doing, and it's also so nice to see that you don't seem to be this place where you have one isolated person working at this here, another isolated person working in this there, and that you have at least some sort of institutional support to work together. That's absolutely fabulous. The question that I have, it can be answered by any of you. All of you touched on this point, but it's basically on the idea of inclusion versus decolonizing. Nina spoke about it a little bit in the beginning of her talk, and there was a conscious option to go for the word inclusion there. I understand some of that discussion. I have had some of these discussions, and again, that's what you have to do in order to make things to go forward, but what prices you pay to get these things going forward. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about how that struggle was for you. Why did you decide on that? What do you feel you gained? What do you feel you lost? So perhaps that we can all learn about this as well when we're having the equivalent discussions at our institutions. Thank you.
So the inclusive part is part of a university-wide role, and I think that while I feel very fortunate to be in a School of Languages, Cultures and Societies and have such wonderful colleagues and be able to have those discussions that are very rich between us, it was a real eye-opener going up to university level and trying to sell, and that's what I've been encouraged to do and want to sell decolonizing across the university, and watching the hackles go up on people and say, oh well, either I don't need to do that because I'm a mathematician and I do facts, and saying, well, okay, well, what is it about the way that you design your modules or the way that you run your years in industry that could be more inclusive? And that started off other conversations that then once you started having those kind of ones, we can start talking about other things to do with decolonization, or that I can bring in allies in other STEM fields. And I'm thinking about STEM because I'm organising a workshop on decolonizing STEM in about 10 days' time. So, but it feels really uncomfortable, and there is plenty to come back, and I get plenty of kickback from colleagues going, well, that's not political enough, and that's not being radical enough. And so I think it's about choosing your vocabulary suited to your audience, and discussing all of that with students, isn't it? And saying that, this is why we use a range of terms, and as Fozia said, this is why one is suited here and this is why one is suited there, and what's the problematic around that. So the inclusive wasn't my choice, but I could see why it was forced upon me at some moments and had to work with it.
Thank you, Nina. Did anyone else want to respond?
Yeah, so I mean, we've had conversations before and around this, and there were keynotes we had at Leeds who kind of problematized that relationship between the two terms. And I think for us, it started as a kind of broader diversification, and then part of that was decolonizing. But I agree with Fozia, it's quite important that we don't see decolonizing as just being a part of, I mean, it is a part of a bigger thing in some ways, but to make sure it doesn't get, I don't know, diluted or kind of have this tokenistic approach perhaps. And I think what might help again is, I mean, what so many have said before is to think about it as a process. and that with whichever term you might start, that you at some point in the process think about, okay, we've tried to diversify, but now we might need to just check, how do we decolonize it more thoroughly or fundamentally. So I think it's quite important to not just say we're diversifying, but at some point to think about decolonizing. What does that actually mean? Part of it is the selection of topics and texts that we select, but I think it's more fundamental. I couldn't know quite in what ways it should be or needs to be fundamental for my own teaching. But I think it's this process where you start thinking about yourself, where might certain knowledge be colonial, and the authors that are used, etc.
Yeah. Could I add a little point?
Of course.
To me, the debate about inclusion and decolonization is illustrative of the scale of the problem, because universities have a problem with inclusion. There are elite spaces. They cater largely to, they cater to many people, but we know that, privately schooled pupils, have an advantage. We know that many different categories of students have an advantage over others. So the university already has a kind of a commitment to including more people and to including more people in research projects through collaboration, research impact. So in that sense, they're signed up to particular forms of inclusion, and that's all good. But then I think the question is, what are you including them in? And is what you're including them in fit for purpose? And I think this is where our students' voices are really, really important in trying to push for change. And it's decolonizing the curriculum is one very important aspect of this. But to me, the challenge is the place where I've really found it difficult to have conversations that have any kind of positive impact is on the question of research. The ref process, it's yes, people involved in the review of the materials are supposed to undergo implicit bias training and so on, but we don't have blind peer review. So many inequalities are embedded within that process, and I don't find many senior research leaders having that explicit conversation. So I would say that there's so much more to do, and it's great that inclusion is on the university's radar. As to be cynical, as money making, as businesses, they need to be inclusive. They need to, bring more people in. The factory of education needs to keep moving forward and expanding. That's the neoliberal model. But really, I think that the question for us and for the sector is, what are we doing to close the attainment gap when people are here, once people arrive? So widening participation is fantastic, but when they arrive, are they actually nurtured as researchers and as thinkers? And what can we do to make their experience meaningful, not on our terms as, usually middle-class, academics, but really on what will empower them as they become contributors to society in a wider sense. So I think that question of inclusion versus decolonization shows you the kind of schismatic nature of the problem and the ways in which universities are not consistent in the way they approach questions of inclusion. They're not clear thinking or comprehensive in how they approach the issue of inclusion.
Thank you very much, Fozia. Sorry, Nina, did you want to come back on that?
Oh, I on a different subject, slightly different having a look at the chat, and with two hats on. One is a mother of a primary school age child who I'm trying to encourage to learn French, though that didn't work very well during lockdown. I've been intrigued by the discussion about primary school education, and I think that's also something that I've been thinking about with somebody who might be coming to a postdoc at Leeds, and with my own Laidlaw scholars who want to take their research out to primary school, is, how much are we losing people on the way with the way that we teach modern languages at primary level and at secondary level. So I've seen some really exciting things in the chat about resources, and if any, I'd be really grateful if we could share those.
We are saving the chat and I can distribute all the resources after the conference that were posted in the chat. So that's not a problem. Yeah, I was about to ask that question about the pipeline, and where we're kind of what we're thinking about primary and moving through schools and then into university. But thank you, Nina. I think we really ought to bring it to an end there because we're already 10 minutes over, and let everybody go off and grab some lunch. And we hope to see you back we're reconvening at 2:00. So slightly shorter. I wondered, did I drop out there? I saw some flashing screens. So slightly shorter break this time, but we're looking forward to see you back at 2:00. And it's the same link, just to remind everybody, the same Zoom link to rejoin the call. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to our speakers, to Nina, to Fozia, and to Stephan for contributing such rich presentations, and to the Q&A today, which was fantastic. So thank you, and we'll see you again at 2:00. Bye now.